A man named Ferrario walked 3 British soldiers through the streets of an occupied Italian town. In broad daylight, he had planned it carefully. He had found civilian clothes for each of them, a jacket, trousers, a coat that didn't quite fit across the shoulders. He had a route in mind that avoided the main road, a farm on the edge of town whose owner he trusted, and a name in the resistance who could take things from there. Nobody had ordered him to do this. He was a guard, a uniformed Italian army guard at a prisoner of war camp. His job, his sworn duty, was to keep these men inside a building with locked doors, not to walk them through a market town in occupied northern Italy with German trucks on the road. But that morning, the camp had already been emptied. Hours earlier, the commandant had assembled all 600 prisoners in the courtyard and opened the front gates. He had told them, "The Germans are coming. I cannot stop what happens next. Go now." Then he had turned to his guards and told them to go home to their families. Most of them did. Ferrario didn't. He stayed. He found 3 officers who were still close to the camp, disoriented, moving too slowly, dangerously visible. He found them civilian clothes. He walked them through the town himself, in daylight, at a pace designed to look like nothing at all. He delivered them to the farm. He made sure they understood the name and address of the resistance contact. Then he turned around and walked back. 6 weeks later, he was arrested. He was executed in the spring of 1944. The 3 men he walked through that town all came home. This is the story of Campo PG 49, a prisoner of war camp in the Po Valley of northern Italy where, on a single morning in September 1943, the guards made a choice that their uniforms did not require of them, where a colonel violated his oath because his conscience demanded it, where one ordinary man paid with his life to give 3 strangers a chance at their own, and where the question that every war eventually forces onto every human being, what do you actually stand for when the structure collapses and no one is watching, was answered quietly, without ceremony, and almost without record. Stay with me. To understand what happened at Campo PG 49 on the morning of September 9th, you first have to understand what the place actually was. Because it was not what most people imagine when they hear the words prison camp in the context of the Second World War. The camp occupied a former orphanage in Fontanato, a small, unremarkable farming town in the Po Valley near Parma, in the agricultural flatlands of northern Italy. The building was large and solid, built in the way institutional buildings of that era were built, to last, to contain, to impose a certain order on the lives inside it. By the summer of 1943, it held approximately 600 British and Commonwealth officers, most of them captured during the campaigns in North Africa. They were officers. That distinction mattered. Under the Geneva Convention, officers were entitled to certain protections: Red Cross parcels, limits on compelled labor, minimum standards of accommodation. Campo PG 49 operated within those limits. There were cricket matches in the courtyard. Men organized theater productions. An escape committee functioned with the quiet efficiency of a small bureaucracy. Guards and prisoners exchanged language lessons. It was a waiting room. That is the only honest description of it. Everyone inside, prisoners and guards alike, was waiting for the war to end. The man running it was Lieutenant Colonel Eugenio Vice Domini. He was a career officer, disciplined, experienced, not given to sentiment or cruelty. He enforced the rules of his camp without adding to them. British veterans who survived Campo PG 49 and wrote about it afterward used a specific word to describe him, with striking consistency across accounts written decades apart. Correct. He was correct. Professional. He administered a difficult situation without making it worse than it had to be. He had also sworn an oath to the Italian state, to the Regio Esercito, the Royal Army, and by the nature of Italy's alliance to the broader Axis war effort. That oath had governed his conduct for years. It was about to become, in a matter of hours, the most dangerous thing about him. Because on the evening of September 8th, 1943, everything Vice Domini's professional identity was built on simply ceased to exist. At 7:45 in the evening, Marshal Pietro Badoglio's voice came over Italian radio. Italy had signed an armistice with the Allied powers. 45 minutes later, Adolf Hitler activated Operation Axe, the German plan to disarm Italian forces, occupy Italian territory, and seize every Allied prisoner of war on Italian soil before those men could reach their own lines. The SS was already moving. 80,000 Allied prisoners were in Italian camps across the peninsula. The clock had started. Before we get to what Vice Domini did in the hours that followed, there is something you need to understand, a decision made months earlier, far away from Italy, in a British War Office conference room, that would turn out to be one of the most consequential and quietly devastating policy failures of the entire war. In the spring of 1943, British military planners faced a genuine dilemma. Italy was clearly weakening. The campaigns in North Africa were going badly for the Axis. An Italian collapse and the release of tens of thousands of Allied prisoners seemed increasingly likely. The question was, what should those prisoners do when the moment came? The answer the War Office settled on was, from a certain administrative perspective, logical. Mass escapes would overwhelm the partisan networks operating in northern Italy, networks that were already fragile, already under pressure from German surveillance. Large groups of men moving through the countryside would expose Italian civilians to reprisals. The organized, orderly option was better. The directive they issued became known as the Stay Put Order. If Italy surrenders, stay in your camp. Do not attempt to escape. Do not join partisan forces. Do not move independently through the countryside. Wait to be officially liberated. Here is what actually happened to the men who obeyed that order. They waited in their camps. They trusted the directive. They followed their instructions. And in the days and weeks following September 8th, German forces went through those camps like a net through water, camp by camp, building by building, and transported every Allied prisoner they found to prisoner of war camps inside the German Reich. The men who obeyed the Stay Put Order spent the rest of the war in Germany. Some of them did not come home. The men who disobeyed it, the men who walked out when gates opened, who hid with Italian farmers, who moved through the mountains toward Allied lines or the Swiss border. Those men were protected by tens of thousands of ordinary Italian civilians who had no obligation to help them, every reason not to, and the death penalty hanging over any household where an Allied soldier was found. Most of those men survived. Obedience was the more dangerous choice. I want you to hold that thought, because it is the invisible architecture under everything else that happens in this story. The official system failed the men it was supposed to protect. The oath, the directive, the military hierarchy, the carefully considered policy from a War Office conference room. All of it pointed the prisoners toward disaster and pointed the guards toward complicity. What saved lives was something the system had no category for. Vice Domini received the intelligence before dawn. We don't know the exact source. The records from those hours are fragmented, contradictory in their details, built mostly from survivor memory. What we know is that at some point between midnight and 6 a.m. on September 9th, he became aware that German SS motorized units were on the road toward Fontanato. He had 2 hours, perhaps less. He had no orders. The government that had issued his commission was in chaos. The alliance that gave his role meaning had just collapsed. Headquarters was unreachable or irrelevant. There was no superior officer to call, no protocol to consult, no procedure that covered this specific morning with this specific set of facts. He walked the building alone. 600 men on the other side of the walls. Men who had been, 12 hours ago, enemy soldiers in his legal custody, his professional obligation to contain. Now, Italy had changed sides. The Germans were enemies. The British were, technically, something else entirely. Every category that had organized this building for the past year had been erased overnight. He had to decide, alone, before sunrise, what he was going to do. He chose. At approximately 6 a.m. on September 9th, 1943, Vice Domini assembled the prisoners of Campo PG 49 in the courtyard of the orphanage. He told them plainly, "German forces are coming. I cannot protect you. You need to leave now." Then something happened that no one expected. Some of them refused. Senior British officers, men who had been told by their own chain of command to stay put, who had internalized that directive so completely that it had become, in their minds, a matter of honor, stood in a courtyard with German trucks on the road and cited the war office order at an Italian colonel who was trying to save their lives. They wanted authorization. They wanted clarity of command. They had orders, and the orders said stay. Vice Domini, according to multiple surviving accounts, looked at these men and said something to the effect of, "I cannot make you go, but I cannot protect you if you stay, and I can tell you what will happen if the Germans find you here." Then he turned to his guards. He told them, "Your duty here is finished. Go home to your families." He opened the gates. Some guards left immediately. They had lives to return to, farms, families, a country that had just changed its relationship with the war in ways no one yet fully understood. They walked away from the camp and became, simply, Italian men in September trying to get home. Some guards stayed, not because anyone ordered them to, not because any regulation required it. They stayed because 600 men were about to walk into a landscape they didn't know, in a language many of them couldn't speak, with German units on the surrounding roads, and someone needed to point them in a direction that wasn't directly into a checkpoint. Those guards distributed the food stores. They identified back roads and farm tracks that bypassed German positions. They pointed men toward villages they knew, toward people they trusted. They did all of this with the sound of truck engines somewhere on the edges of the morning. The German commander arrived at Campo PG 49 sometime that morning. He found open gates, empty corridors, abandoned posts, 600 men gone into the fog. Among the men who walked out of those gates that morning was a 23-year-old Londoner named Eric Newby. Before the war, he had worked in his family's fashion business and done some traveling and writing. He was not a born soldier. He had become one out of necessity, trained as a commando, and in 1942, he had participated in a special boat section raid on an enemy airfield in Sicily, a nighttime insertion that had gone wrong in the ways these operations often do. He was captured before dawn in a dry riverbed, without having accomplished much of anything. He spent the next year and a half in an Italian orphanage waiting for the war to end. He was free now. He was also barely able to walk. His ankle had been damaged and never properly healed, the kind of chronic injury that doesn't incapacitate you, but never lets you forget it. As the 600 men of Campo PG 49 scattered into the Po Valley countryside, moving with various degrees of urgency and direction, Newby moved at a fraction of their pace. Every step was a negotiation with a body that wasn't cooperating. He would have been recaptured within hours, except that Italian farmers came out of the fields to help him. Men and women who had watched this extraordinary morning from their farmhouses, who had seen the gates open and the prisoners spilling out, walked toward Newby rather than away from him. They supported his weight. They moved him off the open road and into the cover of farm buildings before German patrols came through. They did not know his name. He did not know theirs. They shared no language beyond gesture and necessity. Think carefully about what these people were calculating. They were sheltering an enemy soldier, an officer of a nation Italy had been at war with for 3 years, within sight of an occupying German force whose policies regarding Italian civilians who assisted Allied prisoners were explicit, had been stated publicly and had already been enforced elsewhere on Italian soil. Those policies included summary execution. They included the burning of homes. They included reprisals against entire communities. These people knew this. They helped him anyway. And eventually, in the village of Fontanallato, he met Wanda Scoff. She was 22 years old, Slovenian Italian. Her family had roots across the border that Italy shared with Yugoslavia, a complication that gave her an additional layer of vulnerability in occupied territory. She was a schoolteacher, fluent in several languages, and possessed of a kind of sharp, practical fearlessness that Newby would spend decades trying to describe accurately. She wasn't brave in the way that word usually gets used. She was something calmer than that, more deliberate. Her family had made a decision. The record doesn't capture when or how the conversation happened, whether it was a formal discussion or simply an understood thing, to make their home a hiding place. They had room. They had connections. They had, apparently, reached a point where the alternative was intolerable. Wanda became Newby's translator. His connection to the informal networks of partisans and sympathizers that were slowly organizing across the German-occupied North. His window into the actual texture of life in a country that was, in the same moment, collaborating with its occupiers and resisting them, often within the same household, the same village, sometimes the same family. And over those weeks and months, she became the person around whom his survival organized itself. Let's be precise about what she was risking. Every time a German patrol came through, Wanda lied. She stood in doorways, in her own house, in her own village, and spoke to armed soldiers in their language and directed their attention away from rooms and outbuildings where a British fugitive was hidden. Her mother lied. Her father lied. Her siblings were complicit in a deception that, if discovered, ended with all of them dead. And it wasn't only the Germans she had to manage. In every occupied village in northern Italy, there were informers. People who reported to the fascist authorities, the remnant administration that continued to function in the German-occupied North under Mussolini's puppet republic of Salo, for money, for food, for protection, for reasons that varied by person and moment. You could trust most of your neighbors. The ones you couldn't trust were indistinguishable from the rest. Wanda knew this with complete clarity. She hid him anyway. For months, this was their life, a strange, suspended world inside the machinery of a conflict. Newby later described it with the particular precision of a man who has replayed the same memories for 30 years before writing them down. The cold in the outbuildings. The food that appeared from kitchens he was never allowed to enter. The sound of German voices at the front of the house. The long, specific silences afterward. The books Wanda brought him. The Italian he slowly learned. In January 1944, the Germans found him. He was transferred to a series of German camps. He survived to liberation in May 1945. He came back to Italy. Wanda was still there. They married in 1946. He spent the next several decades writing travel books, essays, one remarkable memoir. And in 1971, 25 years after the war ended, he published Love and War in the Apennines. He dedicated it to the Italian families who had hidden him. He named them. He was insistent about naming them. Most of them had received no official recognition of any kind. He died in 2006. By his own account, he never fully found the language for what it meant that strangers had risked everything for him. Some things resist translation. Now we return to the man from the beginning, because everything that has come before, the open gates, the scattered prisoners, the Italian farmers carrying a limping Englishman across their fields. Everything is context for what Ferrario did, and what it cost him. We know the shape of his actions from the testimony of the 3 British officers he helped. That testimony, submitted after the war in various forms, pension documents, veteran statements, personal letters, is what we have. We don't have his own words. We don't have a diary or a letter or a last statement. We have the shape of what he did, as seen by the men whose lives depended on it. He stayed at the camp after Vice Domini dismissed the guards. While others went home, he went looking. He found 3 officers who had lingered too long near the perimeter. They were moving, but slowly, uncertain of direction, visible against the flat fields, vulnerable in a way that anyone who understood the local roads and the timing of German patrols would have recognized immediately. He understood both. He obtained civilian clothing for them. The accounts don't specify exactly how a farmhouse, the camp stores a contact in the village. The point is that he had a plan. This was not improvisation. He had thought about what these men needed and where to get it and how to move them. He dressed them. He walked them through Fontanellado in daylight at a pace that was supposed to look like nothing at all, a man and 3 others moving through a town unremarkable. He delivered them to a farm whose owner he knew and trusted. He gave them the name of a resistance contact who could take things from there. Then he turned around and walked back. He was denounced 6 weeks later. We don't know who gave him up. The record is genuinely unclear. It may have been a direct informer, someone who had seen 3 unfamiliar faces walking through town that September morning and asked questions later. It may have been something else entirely. What we know is that members of the Brigate, the Black Brigades, the paramilitary enforcement arm of Mussolini's Republic of Salo, operating under German authority in the occupied North, came for him. He was arrested. He was interrogated. And in the spring of 1944, he was executed. The 3 men he walked through that town came home. I want to stay with the asymmetry of that for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a sentence. He gave everything. They received everything. That exchange is not balanced. It cannot be made to balance by any language of gratitude or reciprocity or remembrance. 3 men are alive because Ferrario made a decision on a September morning, and the cost of that decision was his life. There is no equivalent return. There is no settling of accounts. After the war, the surviving officers submitted testimony about what he had done. They wanted his name documented. They wanted some acknowledgement, Italian, British, it didn't matter, that he had existed, that he had chosen, that his choice had a human cost that someone somewhere should record. The post-war processes were slow. The politics of reconstructed Italy were complicated. Men who had served the fascist state, even men who had subverted it at enormous personal cost, occupied difficult terrain in a national narrative that was still being negotiated. Ferrario received no state honor. No street carries his name. No monument marks what he did. He is remembered today because the men he saved chose not to forget him. That is the whole of his legacy. There is another story I need to tell you. It comes from the other side of the world. It is in some ways a darker mirror of what happened in Fontanellado, and I think you need both to understand what this episode is actually about. Korea in the 1940s was a Japanese colony. Had been since 1910, occupied, administered, exploited. Korean men had no vote in Japan's wars. They were subjects. They were conscripted. And some of them were sent to serve as guards in a network of prisoner of war camps that Japan operated across Southeast Asia, in Singapore, in Burma, in the Philippines, across the Pacific Theater. They wore Japanese uniforms. Under Japan's colonial assimilation policies, many Koreans have been assigned Japanese names. Their own identities were placed administratively, on paper, as part of a systematic erasure of Korean selfhood. In the camp records, these men appeared as Japanese soldiers. They were not Japanese soldiers. They were colonial subjects performing forced labor in a war that was not theirs. And some of them secretly kept Allied prisoners alive. They shared food from their own rations, meager rations, in camps where everyone was hungry, where the guards themselves were underfed. They warned prisoners before punishments came. A look at roll call, a quiet word through a fence at night. They looked away during escape attempts that, under Japanese military law, they were required to prevent. Some slipped medicine to men dying from diseases that the camp's official medical supply was nowhere near adequate to treat. They did all of this under Japanese officers who enforced discipline with violence. They did it knowing exactly what the penalty was. They did it anyway. Then Japan surrendered. Allied war crimes tribunals were established across the Pacific to prosecute guards who had committed atrocities, and there had been real atrocities documented and systematic. The camps had contained genuine cruelty. Justice was necessary and overdue, but the tribunals processed guards in bulk. They wore Japanese uniforms. Their recorded names were Japanese names. In many cases, the tribunals did not, or could not, distinguish between the man who had beaten prisoners and the man who had kept them breathing. Several Korean guards who had secretly helped Allied prisoners survive were tried as Japanese war criminals. Some of them were convicted. Some of them were executed. The men they had kept alive were home. Some of those survivors didn't know what was happening to the men who had saved them. Some didn't remember names. Some didn't come forward in time, but some did. Their documented cases, painstakingly reconstructed from fragmented records over the decades that followed, of Allied survivors testifying on behalf of specific guards. A face they remembered across the distance of years. A pair of hands passing food through a fence in darkness. A warning whispered before a punishment came. That testimony, in some cases, was enough to change an outcome. In some cases, it wasn't. A man who wore the wrong uniform in a war that wasn't his war, who had a name that wasn't his name, who kept his enemies alive at mortal risk, tried as a war criminal by the nations of the men he had protected. There is no clean lesson to extract from this. It is simply what happened. And it belongs in this story because it completes the picture of what moral ambiguity actually looks like in wartime. Not as a philosophical concept, but as a set of specific, irreversible human outcomes. The numbers from Italy tell their own story. Of the 80,000 Allied prisoners on Italian soil on the night of September 8th, approximately 50,000 eventually reached Allied lines, or escaped to Switzerland, or survived in hiding long enough to be liberated when the war ended. Approximately 30,000 were recaptured by German forces and transported to camps in Germany. Several thousand died in the chaos of those weeks, some in firefights, some from exposure, some from illness, some from the reprisals that came when Italian civilians were discovered sheltering them. The survival of that 50,000 was not random. It was not luck in any simple sense. It was the accumulated result of thousands of individual decisions made by Italian civilians who had no military role in the conflict and no official obligation to any of those men. Farmers who carried strangers across their fields. Priests who hid men in church crypts and lied to German officers at the door. Women who brought food to barns in the middle of the night. Shopkeepers who provided civilian clothes without asking questions. Partisan couriers, the staffette, who moved men through the mountains on routes that existed in no German map. The Catholic Church provided informal cover through its networks of priests and monasteries. The Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale helped organize the movement of men toward Allied lines. Local women and elderly men, precisely the people the Germans considered least threatening and therefore watched least carefully, became the operational core of an escape infrastructure that had no official name and no official existence. All of it was punishable by death. All of it happened anyway. Vice Domini returned to private life after the war. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoir. He made no public appearances about what he had done. When British veterans came back to Fontanilado in the post-war decades, some of them making deliberate pilgrimages to the town, seeking out the man who had opened the gates, he received them with the same professional courtesy he had always exhibited. He answered their questions briefly. He deflected their gratitude with a consistency that became, in itself, a kind of statement about who he was. I simply did what the situation required. That phrase, or variations of it, appears in multiple veterans' accounts, across interviews conducted in different years from different men who came to find him at different times. He seems to have believed it completely, not as false modesty, as an actual description of what he thought he had done, assessed the situation and responded to it appropriately. He never accepted a medal. He never sought official recognition. He died without a state decoration, without a street named after him, without a monument in the town where he had made the most important decision of his life. The building that was Campo PG 49 still stands in Fontanilado. It is privately owned. On the exterior wall, there is a plaque. It is modest, the kind that blends into a building's facade after a few years, that tourists walk past without breaking stride. Most of them do. There is a question that this story has been building toward, and I want to try to name it directly before we close. We have a strong cultural instinct to frame stories like this as stories about heroism, about exceptional individuals who possess some quality that ordinary people lack, a moral architecture more robust than the average, a character that was always going to choose correctly when the moment came. That framing doesn't survive contact with the specifics. Vice Domini was not a resistance fighter. He was a career officer of fascist-aligned state who had administered his duties faithfully for years. He had not been secretly subverting the regime. He had not been waiting for his moment. He was a professional doing his job, and one morning, the job stopped making sense, and he stopped doing it. Ferrario was not a documented anti-fascist. He was a guard. We know almost nothing about him except what he did on one specific morning and what it cost him. He had no manifesto. He left no explanation. He had a plan, he executed it, and he paid for it. Wanda was a schoolteacher who hit a man she had just met. She didn't do it because of politics. She did it because he was there, and she could. And the alternative of watching what happened to people who were not helped was apparently not something she was able to choose. The Korean guards were colonial conscripts wearing someone else's uniform with someone else's name, risking execution to share their food with enemies in a war that was not theirs. None of them were exceptional in the way that word usually means. They were ordinary people operating under extraordinary pressure who reached a specific point where the system they were inside, the oath, the order, the uniform, the directive, the colonial apparatus, the military hierarchy, ceased to be sufficient justification for what that system was asking them to do next. And each of them made a private decision that the person in front of them mattered more than the structure behind them. The structures failed. Italian fascism failed the guards it had sworn to command and the prisoners it had agreed to protect. Japanese colonialism failed the Korean men it had drafted and the Allied prisoners it had caged. British military hierarchy failed the men it had told to stay put. The stay-put order failed spectacularly, and the men who trusted it paid for it with years of their lives or with the lives themselves. What didn't fail was the individual capacity of specific human beings to look at a specific situation and decide that they were not going to be the person who looked away. Here is the dark truth at the center of this entire story. The men who followed every rule, who obeyed every order, who trusted the structures that were supposed to protect them, those men ended up in the worst places. The men who broke things, who violated oaths, ignored directives, walked through occupied streets in daylight with strangers in bad-fitting civilian clothes. Those men came home. The system rewarded compliance. The outcome rewarded conscience. And the man whose conscience cost him everything is buried somewhere without a monument. While the men who walked where he pointed grew old in England and came back, decades later, to try to find a way to say thank you. There is no good ending to that sentence. I want to end where we began. Fontanilado, September 9th, 1943. Morning. A guard named Ferrario is walking three men through town. We know what the light was like, the flat, diffuse light of the Pub Valley in early September, the ground fog that collects in those fields before the sun burns through, the stone and brick of a small Italian town, going quiet and unremarkable in the early morning. We know that German units were on the road somewhere nearby. We know that the men beside him were frightened, and that he was the only reason they were moving in a direction that wasn't a German staging area. We don't know what he was thinking. Maybe the decision had been made hours earlier, and the thinking was finished, and all that remained was the walking. One step, then another. A turn onto a side street that avoided the main road. The farm gate at the end of the path. A face he recognized in the window. Maybe that's what it looks like. The real thing, not the dramatized version. Not a speech, not a moment of cinematic clarity. Just a man walking, doing the next necessary thing. And then the thing after that. He was denounced 6 weeks later. He was executed in the spring of 1944. The men he walked through that town came home. Somewhere in northern Italy, in a record that may or may not have survived the decades, under a name that fewer and fewer people recognize, there's the place where he ended. Somewhere in England, there are families who exist because a man they never knew decided, on a September morning more than 80 years ago, not to go home when he was told. He didn't do it for a monument. He didn't do it for a medal or a street named after him or a plaque on a wall that tourists walk past without stopping. He did it because three men were in front of him, and he could. That is the whole story, and it is enough. If this kind of history matters to you, the names that don't make the textbooks, the people who made impossible choices and left almost no record except the lives of the ones they saved, then subscribe, because there are more of them. More guards who broke their oaths for the right reasons. More ordinary people who found themselves at the hinge point of someone else's survival and chose not to look away. Those stories deserve to be told.